chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The woods run deep around these parts. It's an old forest with tall, soaring pines and cedar trees, which throughout much of the day, in many parts of its deeper reaches, tower so high in their pursuit of the sun that it can sometimes be hard to tell when it's even daylight hours. I love those shady places. The forest spans for thousands of acres, with well-worn trails which attract hikers and tourists almost year-round. It's home to all manner of wildlife, ranging from scrappy raccoons to large and often unfortunately curious black bears. Wolves have even been reintroduced to the area, which as a hunter myself, I can say I'm genuinely happy to see. Nothing breaks a hunter's heart more than to see an ecosystem fall apart due to overbreeding on the part of any given species. For those who may not know, even though the favorite sport, and in my case profession of hunting, involves trooping out into the woods to kill a living thing, one would be hard-pressed to find anyone who both cares and knows about the natural beauty of the forest and its inhabitants more than a hunter. I've spent the better part of my life in this forest, first with my father, who was also a tracker and hunter, learning both his ways and those of the forest itself. Now, as a man of the trade on my own, I've learned to love the land, both for its beauty and its dangers. Old things lurk in old forests. Old things lurk in old places. It's a truth that everyone knows, even if they don't know it. People are right to be wary of venturing too deep into the unknown. This is a lesson, at least I believe, that we've learned as a species from the forests and deep places over time. Stray too far off a beaten path and you can find yourself having encounters with all manner of beasts and wild things that you might neither understand nor have a chance of surviving. I'm an experienced woodsman with a lifetime of familiarity with this forest. I like to call it my forest. I stray from beaten trails and find the deeper recesses of this land regularly and always know the way back. I've even been lucky enough to stumble across lost hikers here and there and have the privilege of being their guide back to their world. Other times, though, I will find myself crossing paths with other things which are not lost, but often looking to be found. Old things. The old things of the old forest. You might not know it, but whenever you enter one of their lands, they're watching you. Always. It's seldom that they bother you, as they both are usually more interested in watching and know that too much attention from our kind could spell the end of theirs. So, usually, they simply linger deep in the background, watching and listening. That is, of course, unless they're hungry. There are rules that are well known in these parts, rules for how to abide in the forest and avoid unfortunate events. Chief among them is to know when you're alone. This sounds more simple than it really is, sadly. However, for the uninitiated, let it simply be known that when walking in the forest, any forest really, it's important to know when you're alone and how to respond to becks and calls accordingly. Every so often, especially if you've been there before and especially if you'd done so with others, you may find as you walk along a path and enjoy the fresh, clean air or errant rays of sunlight peeking through the trees, that you may start to hear a voice which you're familiar with. Perhaps a friend or family member. They will call to you from out of view, beckoning you to follow them off your trail or path deeper into the forest. These are to be ignored, and upon hearing them, one is best to simply turn and run. Furthermore, it is likewise best not to speak of or even think of the call you heard regardless of what it was. Lingering on the notion is said to attract and keep prolonged attention, and you do not want prolonged attention. The calls themselves from the depths of the forest can range in complexity, down from the simple repeating of your name and perhaps a call to come see something, up through more intricate and involved communication. The sort you can tell took some thought. Cries for help sounded in the voices of loved ones such as romantic partners, family members, friends, or children are not uncommon strategies for the old things. The older they are, the better they are with their mimicry, and the more adept at luring you in they become. Should you be foolish enough to follow the voices you hear, you will likely meet an untimely and, frankly, gruesome end. The same often goes for the honestly rare occasions when one may happen to simply spot one in the wild by accident. In either case, the rules remain the same. However, should you walk away or run or even make it to your car and hit the road, the very act of even thinking about what you heard is often enough to keep the old things interested and know that they will follow you. They are hunters, like me. And in that much, at least, I have to say I respect them. Unlike man, they don't destroy the world they live in. Though it is said and suspected that they do possess a deep streak of cruelty, in that they are said to take observable joy in the killing of their prey, they also keep entirely to themselves when not looking for a meal. In the natural world, if we are to cast judgment according to our own standards of morality and right behavior, it would not be unfair to say that dolphins, hippos, and even our ancestral primate cousins in general exhibit acts of cruelty and aggression considerably more than the voices in the woods. And that is not even taking into account what we humans are like. I first encountered one years ago while hunting deer. As carnivores, they will eat anything that lives, and as a hunter, my senses are always trained to notice and observe the signs of other predators. It was while I was tracking a buck I'd been stalking that I came across the first signs of their presence. The buck I was after had been felled, and its eviscerated yet still dying body was laid out upon a rock. Its stomach had been opened and its intestines pulled out and clearly chewed upon. Deep bite marks from teeth, unlike anything I'd ever encountered, littered the creature's body, which still twitched and writhed upon the stone. Taking my skinning knife, I put the poor thing out of its misery. Though I'd not heard a thing and had been tracking the animal for the better part of the day, at some point something particularly brutal fell upon it, and likely only abandoned it upon hearing my approach. As I mentioned, in my experience at least, they are very private and elusive creatures themselves. Picking up its trail proved very difficult, whereas most tracking signs such as outright foot tracks, bent or broken underbrush, or the other more common signs of activity are generally left by any creature, big or small. The signs of this thing were far more subtle. Had it not been for a lifetime of hunting and tracking in those very woods, I would have likely missed them. However, finding faint disturbances on the floor of the forest, which wound about in a pattern that was clearly and certainly a foot trail, I managed to roughly track the direction whatever had killed my buck had gone in. I strode carefully through the deep forest for roughly 3 more hours, having to double back a couple of times upon losing the extremely faint trail I was following. From the looks of the tracks, it seemed as though whatever it was continually changed direction and the length and type of its stride. It wasn't until just before dusk began to settle in that while traversing a small ridge, I saw it. Or, well, saw something. remembering that there are more than one variety of old things in that old forest, it's important not to assume. However, between the tracks and what I've come to learn of them since, I'm comfortably certain about what I saw. It was roughly 100 or so yards away. It was a whitish gray thing, bipedal, yet it seemed to alternate between walking on its hind legs or down on all fours. Its gait was quick and irregular, affirming my suspicions from earlier. Almost as soon as I'd laid eyes on it, however, it stopped and tilted its head upward as though smelling the air. Then, in a fraction of a second, the thing's head whipped clean around in a manner no spinal column would allow for, and it offered me what I can only describe as a smile. I'd say I can only describe it as such, as its face in that moment lacked any form or feature or definition that I could make out, until it opened its mouth in what looked like a grin, all full of long, sharp, pointed teeth, all stained with the blood of its most recent kill. The oddest part, though, was when it spoke. The sound didn't come directly from it, but rather sounded more like it emanated from its general direction. The sound was a voice, a man's voice, not one I was familiar with. "Where are you, buddy? Hey," the voice said as the creature turned and faced me, its head unwinding as its body turned around. It sat there a moment and cocked its head unnaturally to the right. "Hey, buddy," it said again, before quickly turning again and bounding off into the forest at a tremendous speed. I didn't give chase, naturally. Instead, I merely stood, stunned and in honest awe of what I'd just seen. If you spend enough time in the forest and in the area that surrounds it, you inevitably hear the tales of the old ones. The ones who take the voices and sometimes forms of others, lure the unwitting and unsuspecting away from the other's eyes and feast upon them. They go by many names, but you would probably know them best as skinwalkers. I had grown up with stories of them, but for most of my life had written them off simply as old wives' tales told to keep overly adventurous children like myself appropriately afraid of the more common dangers of the forest. Then, having laid my eyes upon one in the flesh, I knew that such were more than mere stories. When I recounted the tale later that evening at the small bar in the center of town, the old graybeards were taken aback and implored me not to speak of or think of the creature anymore, lest it come looking for me. It never did, thankfully. I heeded their advice, save for issuing vague warnings to hikers and tourists I might meet along the trails during my ventures out into the wood. However, that was far from the only time I encountered one. The most terrifying encounter, I would say, came perhaps a year or so later. Once again, I was hunting a buck, stalking it for several hours. I recall rounding a large rock outcropping, the base of a cliff face, when I came across the deer I was after. However, there was something off about it. Something wrong. The manner its legs and shoulders were formed were strange and gaunt. Its misshapen body, however, was far from the oddest thing I observed, as the thing soon reared up on its hind legs. I say reared, when in reality it was more akin to the deer creature simply standing up, as though it walked and stood as a man normally. It shook a bit, its skin moving as though its very skeleton was rearranging itself, and a moment later, it shrank in size until it was roughly as large as myself. The antlers seemed to melt into its head as it shifted from deer to the white, smooth skin of its true self. The hooves turned to feet and hands which themselves bore long, sharp claws as fingers, and the hide of the deer changed then into that same smooth-looking white. It let out two sounds. It is hard to describe them accurately, but I would later come to realize that it was in fact practicing the call of a deer. It twitched a bit, and I sunk behind a large rock to hide, praying it hadn't noticed me. Whether it had or hadn't, it twitched again, letting out another sound, this time in a manner which seemed to be an attempt to mimic a human voice.
Buck.
It stammered, after a series of growls and tones.
Hell of a buck.
It repeated. As it spoke, it continued to twitch, its white skin undulating and changing color. It reminded me a bit of seeing an octopus shifting colors while it hides upon the ocean floor, but soon it became clear that it was attempting to shift into the form of a man. It was imperfect and, to be honest, terrifying, as the arms grew and shrank to different lengths. The head, after growing what looked like hair, extended and retracted, as the neck either grew or sank back into the torso. It even attempted to fabricate the appearance of what I believe was supposed to be a red flannel shirt. This all lasted but a moment before it stopped, shook some more, and reverted to its thin, white-gray natural form. No sooner had it done so than did it fall to all fours and bound off into the forest, its arms seeming almost to grow to accommodate the pose and motion. I will admit, while terrifying, I likewise found the spectacle fascinating. People will often regard things such as this as paranormal or supernatural. But to me, they're both normal and natural, with nothing para or super about them. Nature is boundlessly creative and under no obligation to make sense to any of us. Though the legends state that even thinking about them will draw their attention, my experience has been that such typically only applies when one has already been seen by them and deigned to be a fitting meal. As with most situations regarding predator and prey, it all comes down to, for the most part, to who sees who first. I suppose my lifetime in these places and my profession as a hunter grants me the good fortune to usually see them first. I have had a few of such encounters and find sign of them very often now, yet have never been stalked back to my truck or home, at least not that I'm aware of. One such encounter actually occurred just the other day. I was, as per usual, deep in the forest, some miles from the main trail I usually start on. With me I carried my standard gear. My rifle, which was a Winchester XPR Hunter, was slung over my right shoulder. In my pack I carried my first aid kit, a flare gun, a tent, some matches, rope, and other basic supplies for both casual and emergency situations in the forest. One can never be too careful after all. On my right hip I carried a handgun, a Taurus 357 Magnum with enough stopping power to put down a charging boar. I know this as I've had the occasion to do so once or twice. Upon my left hip hung my knife, which is a large skinning knife with a curved, razor-sharp edge and a finely lacquered wooden handle. Along my belt is my canteen, which I fill fresh from the clean river upon each venture outward, and in my pocket is my flask, which I fill from my bottle of whiskey at home, likewise upon each venture outward. I had every provision I could need, and so set out on my usual route. Typically, I'd stroll along the trail for roughly half an hour or so until heading north into the deeper, untamed woods. Along the trail I passed and greeted 3 separate hikers, all of whom smiled, remarking upon what a beautiful day it was. A casual hello as they passed, with nothing seeming off or bothersome. Soon I reached one of my regular departure points, heading towards a routine spot adjacent to a common feeding spot for elk in the area. After perhaps 2 or 3 hours more of trooping through the trees, I decided to stop and take my lunch. I had packed a simple tuna sandwich along with some chips. Sitting down to eat, I admired the splendor of the area. I have always loved not only the forest, but the fact that despite quite literally growing up there, its beauty never failed to impress me. I had not noticed any sign of elk or deer or any ordinary game animals on my walk thus far. At least, none that appeared fresh or new enough to warrant my attention. In truth, something in me knew that something was off, in that regardless of the stunning beauty of the day and path I had taken, the forest was unusually quiet. Where there was usually birdsong, there was only silence and no scampering critters leaping between branches in the trees. It inspires a truly eerie feeling when one recognizes they are alone in this way, as in my experience, such is usually a sign that one is actually not alone at all. I looked about casually, as even knowing what sort of things lurk within these woods, they were still my woods. I finished my sandwich, folded and put away the remainder of my chips, took a nice long pull from my flask. The whiskey burned pleasantly in my throat as it went down, affording me a rush of warmth against the cool breeze which blew in with perfect timing. I rose and collected my things, policing the area so as not to leave anything behind and spoil the untempered natural beauty of the place, all while keeping my ears and eyes peeled for any sign of motion or life. This is a generally automatic process for me, as my eyes are hunter's eyes, and hunter's eyes are always looking out for such. However, despite even pausing dead in my tracks in the silence, neither heard nor saw a thing. I knew better, though, than to be fooled by such stillness. No better than to trust the silence. I continued then along my way, heading deeper still into the forest, knowing as I did that I was not alone and I was most likely being watched. Another hour passed as I trekked deeper still, the silence following me like a shadow, the unseen eyes in the deep still trained upon me. I cannot say exactly how, but I was somehow certain it was only one set of eyes, and that as they tracked me, their owner enjoyed the stalking of prey. I suppose we can just call it hunter's intuition. But nevertheless, I continued unbothered and unafraid. Every so often, out of the corner of my eye, I would see a fleeting movement somewhere either to my left or right. But no matter how quickly I'd bring my gaze to find whatever it may have been, it was gone, as though it was never there at all. After the third or possibly fourth time, I decided to call out to it, which for those in the know is universally regarded as a bad move. But still, I hollered to it. "Hello there," I said to the forest. "Why don't you come on out? You've been watching me for a while now. Come on out and say hi already." My call was met with more stillness and more silence. I peered around, not actually expecting to see anything. I tried to call out again. "You know, I like stalking prey too. It's almost as satisfying as the kill itself, don't you think?" Again, there was nothing in reply. For a brief and passing moment, I considered if I was merely seeing things as a result of my heightened sense of being watched, but then settled again on the reality of the situation. It had seen me first, and the game was on. I dropped my pack and unslung my rifle. I could still feel it watching me, studying me, as I might the behavior of a buck or boar. Holding the rifle up, I looked about, as though showing it to whatever was watching. Slowly then, I placed it down on the pack and raised my hands, open, so as to show I held no weapons and posed no threat. Still though, no sign. I stood there another moment before calling out one final time. Not sure if it was the same creature I had seen in the shape of a deer before or not. I thought to test the hypothesis, shouting out, "Hell of a buck!" off into the forest. It was then that I got my reply.
hell of
A strange and garbled voice replied from a hidden location. That's right. Hell of a buck, I said, smiling as the conversational lure had apparently worked.
Hell of a buck.
Help!
Help!
It stammered, clearly working to recite its own lures. These creatures are typically known to repeat and mimic speech and sounds they hear, so as to draw in potential prey, often by calling for help in what is typically a voice familiar to them. In a fashion, I do think it was attempting to imitate a local hunting friend of mine named Rodney, as the pitch almost matched, and he was fond of bragging about the deer he'd bag. Oh, so you need some help, do you? I replied, almost jokingly.
Help! Hello? Come here.
It responded. I laughed. No, you come here,
Come here.
it said, this time with what sounded more like a child's voice. No, I'm right here. Come and get me, I said, this time in a challenging tone. Several moments of silence passed as I awaited its next reply. Instead, just from behind me, I heard a slight rustling and turned immediately to see what it was. From behind a tree, slowly, emerged the misshapen attempt at mimicking my friend Rodney. It was a poor attempt, with the right shoulder drooping and the left arm longer than the right. The face was a terrible mock-up, not only of Rodney, but of a human being in general, with the eyes both offset to the left, the nose an almost comically large hooked protrusion, and the ears set at different heights along the side of the head.
hell of a buck.
It said slowly. I couldn't tell if it thought I was fooled by its poor attempt at a disguise, or not, as it slowly approached me. It cocked its head to the side, so curious or interested at the sight of me. Ah, so you're a young one, aren't you? I asked. Still can't quite get the whole voice and look thing right. I spoke more to myself than it, as I was sure it didn't quite grasp what I was saying. However, much to my surprise, it stopped, and while it looked at me, offered me something that resembled a nod of its head. Oh, so you can understand me. Again, it cocked its head to the side before slowly attempting a nod once more. Well, isn't that interesting? My name is Nate. Its reply was garbled again, as it attempted to recite the new words it had heard.
Name is Nate.
I pointed to myself. Yes, Nate. I am Nate. You, I said, then pointing to it. You can be Bob. It strained its head in a curious fashion, clearly expressing some form of interest or intrigue to me in what I was saying. It touched its own chest, as I had, and slowly spoke.
Nate.
It said. I corrected it. No. Pointing to myself, I reiterated. I am Nate. You are Bob. I finished, pointing again to the creature. Again it pointed at itself, this time saying,
Bob.
Yes, Bob. You can be Bob. The intelligence, or apparent intelligence, to these creatures had always fascinated me. More than merely hearing and repeating as a parrot might do, I had always suspected they did, or at least had the potential to understand what they hear and say. Here, Bob was all but proving that to me, completely. Do you like to hunt, Bob? I asked slowly. The creature again cocked its head from side to side, as though attempting to fashion some understanding as to what I was saying as I spoke. This is something you learn about these creatures over time, something which makes them even more dangerous than their legends and folktales suggest. It isn't merely that seeing one, being heard by one, or just thinking about them can draw them to you, nor is it merely that they hear and repeat the sounds of words to use as lures. No. The real danger is that in your speech to them, they hear and learn not only the sounds of words you speak, but the ideas, concepts, and even to a certain extent, of you into your mind in relation to what you're saying. This is how they've come to be known to track people the ways they're said to do. That connection, it isn't just momentary. In truth, they are surprisingly intelligent and adaptive creatures. This is why they listen and why they watch. It can be easy for people to regard things that aren't people, which perhaps behave in ways that people don't, as being less intelligent or aware. But every good woodsman or hunter knows that the things that live in the forest know far more than they do, and it's best to keep a level of respect for any wild thing in its own natural habitat. Bob jerked a bit more and responded in his broken speech.
Hunting. Hell of a buck.
He said, as his head seemed to almost violently bob around atop his shoulders, swaying and swinging from side to side. His eyes never left mine and never blinked. That's right. Hell of a buck, I replied. As I spoke further, my thoughts went more intently to my words. After all, the creatures of the deep woods often learn considerably more from you than you might intend to tell them. So it's important to choose your words carefully and wisely. You ever take down a buck, Bob? I asked, forcing my thoughts to consider the shape and what I know of hunting bucks and their behavior into the very front of my mind. I honestly swear sometimes I could feel that psychic bond that would form as the creature would use my words to enter my mind. I felt Bob understand my thinking, and had such affirmed when a moment later he righted his poorly mocked-up version of Rodney's head, with it now straight up and down. From the forehead grew a set of antlers, just as one might see on a young male deer. They lingered atop the misshapen human head in a frame for a moment before seemingly melting back into the scalp. Buck, Bob said with what I guess you could call self-assurance. That's it. Now, do you know about the world? I asked, again tuning my thoughts specifically to my desired idea. I wished to show him the broader world beyond the forest, and, if I was very lucky, that within him and his kind existed enough self-awareness and intelligence to possibly be a part of it.
The world.
Bob said, struggling with each syllable. I began to wonder if he wasn't perhaps younger than I thought. The world, Bob? It's a big, big world out there with lots of things in it to learn about, I replied, stepping around to the creature's left side. As the mock antlers submerged again into its forehead, the lumpy and disfigured image of Rodney it was attempting to mimic faded, and soon its own smooth, almost glittery, white, figureless face and head were all that remained. Soon the entirety of the mock-up had seemingly dissolved, leaving a naked, white, and largely formless creature before me. Its mouth was a long, thin slit along the lower portion of what I suppose you'd call a face. Yet no other features could be perceived. It looked up into the small patches of bright blue sky with, again, what I suppose we can call its face, seeing their brilliance peek through the forest canopy above. Its head tilted left to right and back again, in what genuinely looked to be an act of contemplation. It helped that as I kept my eyes upon it, as well as actively thinking about it, I brought into my thoughts notions of individuality that it had clearly never considered. As a shapeshifter and hunter, its life was one of stalking, mimicking, attacking, and feeding upon, and then hiding from other creatures. However, to know that its own knowledge of itself, its actual innate freedom to learn, think about, and exist within a broader world, were as much thrilling as overwhelming to the creature as it struggled to, for the first time, actually consider its nature in the universe. It is always a glorious moment to behold, and something more capable of thought and more full of personality than we know looks upon creation and realizes its place within it. It was in this moment of pause that I drew my .357 Magnum from my holster, now standing behind the awakened, sentient creature in the midst of its first existential crisis, and placing the barrel just behind the base of the skull, fired. It dropped to the ground dead, instantly. The body jerked and twitched for a few seconds after it fell, and then it went finally still. Goodbye, Bob. At this point, there was little left to do but the job. Holstering my weapon, I drew my blade and proceeded to gut and skin the wretched dead thing, separating the slightly shimmering outer layer of thick, white-gray flesh from the muscle and bone. I soon had the creature stripped to nothing but a meat-wrapped skeleton. I tended to leave it for the crows, as so far as I can tell, they're the only scavengers that'll eat the damn things. I've tried the taste of skinwalker before, and I'll be honest, it isn't for me. Hell, I doubt it's for anyone. But the skin, however, the skin is one seriously hot commodity. If only the well-to-do ladies in places like Paris and Manhattan had the slightest clue where their leather for their handbags and shoes really came from, what the beasts looked like. Well, as funny as the look in their faces might be, that would probably put me out of a job. Thankfully, cryptid hides remain a must-have material for the makers of more exclusive fashion items, and so long as they lurk in the forests, my forests, I make sure they remain in plentiful supply. Because the woods run deep around these parts, and old things lurk in old forests. The trick is just to make sure that one way or another, you see them first. Sorry again, Bob.